Hello everyone, my name is Ryan and welcome back to another episode about art. So today in this episode we are going to be taking a look at shading and basic shading notes. So before we begin, as always, I'd like to mention that I am not a professional. I am pretty good at shading, but I am not a professional in any sort of way. So if you do need actual help or if you are looking for more professional aid, then I recommend you either go to the library, pick up a book, or just talk to a teacher or an actual professional about art. But then again, with that being said, I am still pretty good, so I do recommend you listen to what I have to say, and yeah, hope you enjoy. But anyways, now that we have a solid introduction out of the way, and you're now all pumped up and ready to shade, let me tell you how to shade, and cover the very basics of shading. So an object when shaded contains 5 key features. Now, depending on who you ask and whatever source you get, a lot of people, well, there are a lot of different sources basically giving a million different terminologies about different parts of a shaded object, but for now, for simplicity, I say keep to these 5. So these key features are the highlight, the midtones, the core form shadow, also known as the terminator, the reflection, and the cast shadow. So in order from top to bottom, or left to right, or however you're drawing it, you would start off with the highlights. Now, you would never start off drawing the highlights. That's a very misconception. Anyways, the highlight is the brightest point or line of an object. It is where the light from your light source hits the object directly. You could say at a perpendicular angle. Now, the color of the light is often going to be white or yellow, and of course the color of the light affects the color of the midtone as it slowly changes from light to dark. Now, technically speaking, the highlight refers to the absolute brightest point of an object, but for simplicity, you could just imagine the highlight as the light area of the object, or that's actually technically the midtone. So sometimes in certain drawings, the highlights can be less obvious. For example, if you're drawing something really smooth and reflective, like metal, for example, or fruit, the highlight will be very obvious, and you can easily spot it in a drawing. However, if you look at something softer, like for example wood or clothing, you may notice that the highlight is a lot harder to see, and instead of a single highlight, it's more of just a general gradient light area instead. And of course, an object can have multiple highlights. Now, this doesn't mean that the object has multiple light sources coming to it. In fact, sometimes it's a single light source, except because of the way the object is shaped, it can contain different highlights depending on the position or the angle of which the light hits the object. You may notice that a lot of artists, when drawing really complicated shapes, include more than one highlight, and that's just because of how the shape curves and how it reflects the light. You may also notice that some artists draw highlights as lines instead of dots. Now, that's usually if, for example, if you had an object with a straight edge like a cube versus an object that has a smooth edge like a circle or a sphere. Now, the midtone is often referred to as the core color and the main color of the object you're drawing, and is located between the highlight and the core shadow. Now, usually the midtone contains the most amount of contrast, not brightness. Brightness is very different from contrast. You need to know the difference between those two, but it contains the highest amount of contrast. In other words, it is the most purest of color in the object. Now, the reason we have midtones is so that the shading between the core shadow, the darkest point, and the highlight, the lightest point, looks a lot smoother instead of two very contrasting colors. Now, quite often the midtone is one of the most difficult things to shade because more often than not, you have no idea what's going on, and a lot of artists, a lot of people tend to just randomly shade it in. This also brings up the topic of hard shading versus smooth shading, which I will talk about later in the episode, and it's where you will spend probably the majority of your time shading things. And finally, if you're using something like a graphite pencil to shade, never ever smudge it ever. Just never ever do that, okay? No. That's the #1 mistake that beginner artists make. They think that smudging everything will make it all look fine and dandy, when in fact it's the opposite. Smudging shows that you have no skill whatsoever. A lot of people just try smudging it because it doesn't look nice, but after you smudge it, you'll realize it doesn't look nice even more. Now, yes, there are effective ways to smudge and proper ways to smudge and proper tools you use to smudge instead of using your finger. That's the reason we have paper pencils. But if you're starting out, absolutely do not smudge. It doesn't help you learn, it doesn't help you practice, and quite honestly, it doesn't make your artwork look better, okay? Using clean shading and hatching techniques is the #1 way of showing that A, you have skill and you know what you're doing, and B, it just looks a lot nicer than trying to smudge everything into a big gray blob of messiness. And I cannot emphasize that more enough when you're drawing. Now, the next part is probably the main important part and probably the biggest aspect of shading, which is the core shadow, hence shading, shadowing. Okay, so usually when someone refers to the core shadow or the terminator, it is often the darkest point or darkest line or edge on an object. It is never solid black, but it is an extremely dark color. This is also often referred to as the shadow's edge, since it is the edge of the shadow. Now, the core shadow, being the darkest part of the object, is often between two other lighter areas, the reflection and the highlight slash midtone. It is also often the main part of shading, and if you're shading the core shadow, you gotta make sure that it is dark. The darker your core shadow is, the darker or the greater your contrast will be between your light and your darks. Some people, when they start drawing, including myself, are often afraid of shading things or shading shadows extremely dark. For me, it's because I thought that if you shade it really dark, it will throw the entire contrast off because the contrast will be too great. As long as you make sure your core shadow is in the right place and is the right size, the contrast won't actually hinder your artwork. In fact, it'll probably make it a lot better than if you were to use a bunch of different grays. And finally, the core shadow slash shadow's edge slash terminator always curves along the edge of the shape. In other words, it defines an object's shape, because its shape is what creates the shadow, and hence is what makes it dark. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Next, we have the reflections. Now, reflections are the most complicated and the most often overlooked and ignored aspect of shading. Reflections are everywhere, let's just put it at that. Everything reflects, whether it's the light, whether it's an object, whether it's the floor, whether it's everything. Everything reflects light, as you will know in your science class. Now, quite often, if you're doing a still life, the reflection usually comes from the floor and other nearby objects. Now, if you look at an object or a sketch of an object, you may notice that after the core shadow, between the core shadow and the cast shadow, you may notice that there's a bit of a light hue, a bit of a light area, and you might wonder, where does that light come from? Well, that, my friend, is a reflection from the floor specifically. You see, when the light hits the floor, it reflects it back up and into the object, because that's how light works. So therefore, since that part of the object is close to the ground, some of the light that gets reflected from the floor gets reflected onto the object, and thus makes it seem a little bit lighter. This also applies for nearby objects. So for example, if you have an orange and an apple, you may notice that the side of the orange next to the apple looks a little bit red, and the side of the apple next to the orange looks a little bit orange. Now, if you're going into color theory and, well, painting or shading with color, this reflection or these reflections start to become a lot more complicated, and so we're not going to talk about that in this video. But in terms of basics and shading in grayscale, the reflection is often the area of the shape that receives a little bit of external light. You may also notice that the use of reflections also help make an object look more three-dimensional. Now, the final aspect of shading is the cast shadow. So essentially, the cast shadow is, of course, the shadow that an object produces. Now, the cast shadow contains two main parts, the occlusion shadow and the general gradient part of the shadow. So the occlusion shadow is the darkest part of the shadow in the area that is closest to the object, assuming that the object is convex. The reason it's called the occlusion shadow, and the reason it's the darkest part of any drawing, not just the shadow, is because it's the area that receives absolutely no external light whatsoever. It's not affected by reflections because it's, well, covered by the object, and it's behind the object, so it doesn't receive any light from the light source. Now, the rest of the shadow is in the form of a gradient that goes from dark to light. Of course, the occlusion is the darkest part, so naturally, as the shadow fades out, it becomes lighter. Now, the reason for this is because the farther or the longer the shadow is, the farther it is from the object. Now, since it's farther from the object, there's more influence from the surrounding light and the surrounding reflections, therefore making it seem a bit lighter and have a gradient. In fact, another reason for the gradient is because the light that actually bounces off the object also reflects onto the ground, as the same way that the light from the ground reflects onto the object. Now, technically, the fewer reflections and the fewer light sources there are, the more clean and the more smooth and aligned the shadow might seem. Anyways, we're going to end it here today. Join us in the next episode where we're going to be talking about different styles and methods of shading. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Adios, bye.